I've done in my professional life that I'm most proud of was the opportunity to represent Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson in their civil suit against Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Louis Libby, and Richard Armitage for violating their rights. The context of this, of course, occurred in 2003 when President Bush in his State of the Union address said that Iraq was planning to try to acquire uranium from Africa. This time, Joe Wilson, who had been a deputy ambassador and an ambassador in other countries, did an investigation and found there was no truth to this. In June of 2003, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times indicating what he had found in his investigation. What he did find, didn't find. That's probably the better way to put it. And he also appeared on talk shows. At this point, we know that Richard Armitage leaked to Robert Novak that Valerie was a CIA agent, and as a result of this, there was a concerted effort by the vice president, by his top aide, Louis Libby, by Karl Rove, by Richard Armitage, to destroy the career of Valerie Plame in retaliation for Joe Wilson's speech. In fact, it was a statement by Karl Rove to Chris Matthews at Hardball that Valerie Plame was now fair game to give rise to the title of her book and the movie based on her book. Just a little bit of biography of Valerie. Born in Anchorage, she attended Penn State University, got a master's from the London School of Economics, and then had a very distinguished career in government service. I was so thrilled and honored when Valerie and Joe agreed to speak here today. Joe apologizes that he's in Tunis for work and couldn't be here, but so delighted to welcome Valerie to the law school. Thank you so much for being here.
Erwin, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Good afternoon. I want to say the first time that I met Erwin was when he so kindly stepped up and agreed to help us in our legal civil suit. And I will remember always, I'm not a lawyer, and I feel sometimes when I was watching the initial proceedings that I really only got the prepositions, and some verbs. But I looked, as I was settling into my seat, I was an observer, and I saw the entire legal team of Cheney, Libby, Rove. There must have been at least 8 lawyers, and they were like the Hollywood picture of the snappy lawyers. They came and they had their briefcases, and their hair was perfect, and their suits were sharp, and they took up the entire table on that side. And then I looked over at Erwin, who had like a legal pad in front of him. I'm not making this up. It was like, he had like 8 pages of legal notes. And I thought, okay. And those lawyers went first for Cheney, Libby, Rove, and they did their thing. And Erwin stood up and completely eviscerated their arguments from not even using his legal pad. And the judge, you could tell, whose name right this minute I forget, is Bates, was clearly totally intellectually engaged, and they were sparring and back and forth. I've never seen anything like it. I still don't feel that I had complete comprehension, but I got that I had outstanding counsel, and I'm so grateful for all that you've done. Thank you. Yeah. So this is a story, as Erwin said, that started in 2003, and not for everyone, but for many people in this room. I think you were in grade school. So, which is true, right? And it was one of those stories that waxed and waned in the media. Sometimes there was that bright, hot media light on it, and then it would go away, and then come back in a different form. And it was really hard to follow the thread. So what I like to do today is to speak to you about my story, helpfully put it into context, refresh your memories, and explain why it matters. Why it matters is because this is a story of power and the abuse of power. Let me be very clear, this is not an issue, a partisan issue. It's not a Democratic issue, it's not a Republican issue of what happened to me, but it's an issue of national security and power and the consequences of speaking truth to power. I was fortunate enough, and I proudly served my country as a CIA covert operations officer. I loved my job. I thought I had the best job in the world. And I was highly trained to do it. In my training, I got to do things like fire a variety of automatic weapons, jump out of airplanes. I went through a variety of different interrogation exercises. I got to do escape and evasion in the woods for weeks at a time. And then in my career, I traveled the world. I recruited spies on behalf of U.S. intelligence. I developed an expertise in nuclear counterproliferation, which means essentially I tried to make sure that the bad guys, whether they're rogue states or terrorists, did not get a nuclear weapon. And I did this as a woman, and then as a wife, and then as a mother. And all of that changed very suddenly one day in 2003 when a conservative columnist, Robert Novak, at the request and direction of senior White House officials, published my covert CIA affiliation and identity in his column. And this was done as political payback to my husband, Joe Wilson, because he had the audacity to go after the primary rationale that the Bush administration had given for our war in Iraq, which was the nuclear threat, an imminent nuclear threat. Some of you may recall that senior administrations were using the refrain, we don't want to see the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud over and over again. So that's why that's what would happen. It was political payback, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story so you can understand what led up to that. First, I want to tell you why I joined the CIA, because I'm pretty sure that me standing before you is maybe not what you had in mind, of someone who's worked undercover for the CIA. Because the popular culture and movies always tend to show, particularly female operatives, highly sexualized, highly physical, guns. I'm sorry, I don't have a sequin gown on to ruin it. But I joined the CIA because in my family, public service was seen as something noble. My father was an Air Force career officer. He fought in the South Pacific during World War II. My brother was a Marine who was wounded in Vietnam. My mother was a public school teacher. So this notion of public service was something that seemed to be perfectly normal in my family. And so when I was given this opportunity to join the CIA, I leapt at it because, first of all, it seemed like a lot more interesting than what any of my friends were doing. The government was going to pay me to live and work overseas. And it sounds corny, but it was a chance to do something really interesting while I served my country. So as you might imagine, it's a really long and involved process to get into the CIA. I went through many, many interviews, psychological evaluations. They do a security background check, medical exams, all of that, and it was all pretty much a blur. Except to this day, I remember on one of the multiple choice exams that I took, one of the questions was, do you like tall women? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. So I don't know, I guess I answered whatever I did that was right because they offered me a job. And I ended up in the Directorate of Operations. Let me very briefly give you a little wiring diagram of how the CIA is set up so you know where I was. There's 4 directorates. One of them is Director of Operations. They do the core mission of the CIA, which is recruiting foreign spies to provide intelligence to senior U.S. policymakers so hopefully they can make right decisions. There's a Directorate of Intelligence, DI. Those are the analysts. They're the people that are bringing in all this information from around the world, collaborating it, collating it, disseminating it back out into the intelligence community. There is the DS&T, Director of Science and Technology. Everyone knows who Q is, right? In James Bond, the shoe phone. I don't have a shoe phone, but you get the idea. Satellites and all that stuff. And the Directorate of Administration. They're the logistics folks who make sure that this truly worldwide operation functions. So I was in the Directorate of Operations. And specifically in the time period in the run-up to the war, I was in a division within that called Counterproliferation Division. The DO is primarily set up along geographic lines. You know, there's European division, Latin American division, so forth. But there were two aberrations. One was the Counterterrorist Center, and one was where I was, Counterproliferation Division. These two places really, in the first time in the history of the CIA, put operations people such as myself literally side by side with the analysts, with the hopes of getting better results. Prior to that, there was really a very firm line between those people. But they realized these two issues of terrorism and WMD were emergent threats. They're transnational issues. We have to approach it in a whole different way. Some of you may recall, or you may have read, in the mid-90s there was a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. And that was the first time that U.S. government as a whole really sat up straight and paid attention to this issue of WMD, of this emergent threat. Prior to that, there had just been, you know, like two people over here who thought about it, and someone over there in that agency, and someone there. But they pulled them all together, set up this division, Counterproliferation Division, and it was brilliant working there because they were people, they're world experts in whatever their field, the top-notch physicists, world's experts in biological weapons. And I thought of it when I was working there as sort of the island of misfit toys because they didn't always play well together, but the mission was very clear. And I'm proud to say that one of the first big successes of that division, I worked alongside people that we brought down the AQ Khan nuclear network. You might recall in December of 2003, Libya was caught red-handed in trying to implement their own nuclear program, of which AQ Khan had a really important part. And it took years of operational planning and really creative thinking about how to do that. So that's where I was. So let me take you to 9/11. Everyone in this room remembers exactly where you were. I was in CIA headquarters talking to Jordanian liaison. And as we now know, there was still smoke coming off the World Trade Towers when then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was unfolding targeting maps at the conference table at Camp David and saying, you know, there's not much in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, here we've got some things here and here and here. So the CIA immediately pivoted, as they do, and set up what I'll call an Iraq task force. And the idea was to try to have a better understanding of what exactly was going on in Iraq at that time. Our intelligence at that moment in time was extremely thin because we hadn't had an embassy there since the first Gulf War. Saddam Hussein had kicked out the UN weapons inspectors in '98. So when I sat down as chief of operations of this Iraq task force, we had almost nothing. And what my job and my colleagues' job at the time was to figure out what were the scientists up to, what was the state of the play of their presumed weapons program, how were they acquiring the materials needed for their nuclear program, their R&D, all of that. How were they procuring it, the whole thing. So that's where I was. Let me fast forward a little bit then to February 2002. So it's just a couple months after still the shocks of 9/11. And a young woman who worked for me came up to me very agitated because she had just received a phone call from the office of the vice president. And they were inquiring about this intelligence report that had been circulating in the community for some weeks at that time about the transfer, the sale of yellow cake uranium from Niger, a very poor West African country, to Iraq. Now, if this had proven true, that would be really significant. It would demonstrate for sure that Saddam Hussein was seeking to reconstitute his nuclear program. But I have to tell you the truth, at that moment, I was more sort of taken with the notion that the office of the vice president had called this very junior officer at their desk at CIA headquarters to inquire about this report. I got to tell you, we have protocols, and there's channels, there's ways that happens, and that wasn't it. So I was just sort of taking this in, and a reports officer walked by, one of those analysts I told you about earlier, and he heard what was going on, and he said, well, what about asking Joe, meaning Joe Wilson, my husband, to look into this? The reason he said that, well, there were three reasons. He knew that Joe had lived and worked in Africa for over 20 years as a U.S. diplomat. He knew that Joe had served as our charge d'affaires at the embassy in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. He had met with and negotiated with Saddam Hussein for the safe release of hundreds of hostages. And Joe had done a clandestine mission for the agency on another issue previously, so it was a known quantity. So I said, well, okay, let's go talk to the boss about this. So we told the boss what was going on, the situation, and he said, well, Valerie, when you go home tonight, would you please ask Joe to come into headquarters next week, and we'll get the right people in the room, and we'll figure out what we're going to do. Sure, of course, which I did. So Joe came into headquarters the next week, and I was not at that meeting. I escorted him in, that was it. And it was determined that he should go out to Niger and check out these reports because things were moving quickly. The administration was keen to get any intelligence. 500 tons of yellow cake uranium, that's a big deal. So he went, and he was literally getting out of the taxi in front of our home in Washington, D.C. when he was on his return, and he was met by an analyst and this reports officer who had initially suggested him, and they debriefed him in our home. And what Joe said was, these reports, totally bogus. There's no way, and here's why. Dun, 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 dun. But they were so, and they took all that information, they were so eager to turn that report around and get it back to the vice president's office and within the intelligence community. Very important. Okay, so Joe and I, he felt good that he had been asked to do something. He went, of course, pro bono, because it was a serious question. I mean, just his travel expenses were paid. I was glad that he could perhaps be of help, move on to something else. I had lots of other things I had to do at the office for sure. And it was left at that. So now let me fast forward you again to January of 2003. And President Bush gives his State of the Union address. And in it, he uses the now infamous 16 words. Through the British government, we have learned that Saddam Hussein has recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. So I was watching this at home, and of course I was remembering Joe's trip of almost a year previously. But, you know, there are other countries on the continent that mine and produce this yellow cake uranium. Maybe the president wasn't referring to Niger, you know, who knows. And Joe said the same thing. He'd been watching it somewhere else. So we just took note, but moved on. Because the war drums are beating big time at this point. We're really here, the American public is being, the words are washing over us about how dangerous Saddam Hussein is, his weapons of mass destruction. We don't want to see the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud. So just, I think it's almost just a week later, then Secretary of State Colin Powell gave his address before the United Nations. His job was to sell to the rest of the world this notion that we would go to war with Iraq. And I don't know about you, but I was really interested to see what Colin Powell would have to say, because he has served his country so well. His reputation was just sterling. Almost everyone thought extremely highly of him. And as I watched his presentation, I was watching it from headquarters on the TV with my colleagues, I was experiencing what I can only describe as cognitive dissonance, whereby what General Powell was saying in no way matched the intelligence that I was seeing. He made it sound much more robust and sort of like an open and shut case, and that wasn't what I was seeing at all. In particular, there was that case of a source codenamed Curveball, who was the primary source for the administration's claims of a biological weapons capability in Iraq. Turns out, as I knew then, that Curveball was a drunk, a fabricator, known fabricator. He defected from Iraq. He was now, at that point, under German intelligence control. We didn't have any access to him. Everyone who followed this case knew he was useless. So there was a colleague of mine sitting next to me watching this. She had followed that case much more closely than I, and I said, "What the hell is going on?" She said, "I don't know." So I went back to my desk hoping that the president and those in his immediate circle knew a hell of a lot more about this than I did. That they really had intelligence that they were going to take this country to war on, because I didn't see it. I mean, I'm, halfway up the food chain there, and I was just hopeful that there is no more important decision that we as Americans take about whether we are going to send our men and women into war to kill and die in our name. And I was deeply worried. So of course we went to war. We went to war in March 2003, shock and awe, all of that. And I remember feeling that we had failed miserably at the CIA. I thought this was just such a rush, that we had failed. We had failed to find WMD, that I thought our troops were in mortal peril, because there was no doubt in my mind that if Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, he would use them. He'd already demonstrated that on his own people, the Kurds, using gas, poison gas. And I thought, we just screwed up. We didn't have enough time. I mean, I should have been talking to these people over here instead of that one there, and then I should have listened to this person here, and I should have put money there and that's all I could. I was sick. I was absolutely sick, as the rest of my colleagues, because I thought we went to war just not really knowing what we would find. So as this is going on and unfolding, and the insurgency appears to be picking up some steam, and the Baghdad Museum is looted of priceless antiquities, and we're told what is, and all that. Joe, in the meantime, is trying to get to the bottom of the 16 words in the president's speech. So he's talking to his former colleagues. At this point, he was retired from the State Department. He was talking to his former colleagues in the State Department. He's talking to staffers on Capitol Hill. And he's told, yes, it was Niger the president was referring to. But, if you want to do anything about it, it's up to you. So a couple things precipitated his op-ed piece. In June 2003, then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice goes on Meet the Press. And about these reports, she says very dismissively, well, maybe someone down in the bowels of the agency knew about these reports, but no one in my circle, which we knew to be erroneous. And then Joe was also warned by a journalist, listen, this story, which up to this point had sort of been like on the back burner, bubbling a little bit, about this unnamed former or retired ambassador had gone to Niger and debunked these claims, and the administration knew it, and yet it appeared in the State of the Union address, that this story was about to boil over, and he would be named, and if he wanted to do anything about it, it was up to him. So after a great deal of thought and consideration, not so much with me, but on his own, he decided to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times, what I didn't find in Africa. So it's 1,500 words, and he says, I was sent by the CIA to Niger. I investigated these claims. There's nothing to it. One thing I forgot to add, he didn't put this in the article, but just to tell you, these claims where he said that this is totally bogus, that these 500 tons of yellow cake uranium, that was in other reports by same conclusion from our ambassador there, as well as the four-star Marine general who had also investigated it. Same thing. They all said the same thing. But so he writes this piece, and he did it. He was subsequently portrayed as this crazy partisan Democratic figure, but at that time he wasn't thinking at all in partisan terms. He was thinking as a citizen. You hold your government to account for their words and deeds. If he were here, he would tell you that all he wanted to get out of it was his elementary school teacher that had given him a C in civics to say he's improved. You know, he wanted to be a good citizen, truly. So the very next day, after this op-ed comes out, the White House acknowledges that the 16 words did not rise to the level of inclusion in the president's address, which was sort of an apology after a fashion. And Joe thought he had done what he wanted to do, hold his government to account for their words and deeds. And we were prepared for pushback, of course. You know, that administration demonstrated a very thin-skinnedness, if that's the word, in terms of any sort of criticism. So he had like all his, and quite voluminous correspondence with the first President Bush. He had his medals and his honors and his picture with Barbara Bush in the Rose Garden and whatnot to say, look, you know, I'm not, you know, this is not a political thing. I'm doing this because it's a matter of war and peace. So we were prepared for that, but we were not prepared for what happened on the 14th of July, which is when Joe came into our bedroom very early in the morning, and he tossed the paper on the bed, and he said, well, the SOB did it. And he was referring to Robert Novak and his column, and whereby I was named as a CIA officer. And I don't know if you've ever had a moment in your life where you really do feel that everything changes, but it was one of those. I was in shock. I was thinking of my career, my covert career, everything that I loved is over. I'm thinking about all the assets with whom I'd worked with over the years are in serious jeopardy because of their any sort of relationship with me. And I'm thinking about the physical security of my 3-year-old twins who are sleeping in the room next door. Everything comes crashing down. And the only thing I think of to do is to like write on those little yellow sticky notes, you know, the things that I needed to do for my assets and the people who had relied upon me, and I took responsibility for their safety. And it began a years-long character assassination campaign against my husband and myself. He was called a liar, a traitor, worse. I was accused of nepotism because I had sent him on this trip to Niger, which, as you know, is really a garden spot. Look up what nepotism means. I was called a glorified secretary, which, you know, so it was all to denigrate us and to denigrate the story, because, you know, that didn't really those Wilsons, that it just is nonsense. It's a mountain out of a molehill. Please move along, folks. Please move along. And it was like falling down, as I think of it, as Alice's rabbit hole, where white is black and black is white. We would be reading about these people, Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame, in the newspaper or see them on TV or hear about them on the radio, and they had nothing to do with who we were and what our values were. And what it was surreal. It was really surreal. And it was, as you might imagine, extremely hard on our marriage. If any of you have seen the movie Fair Game, I think Sean Penn does a really good job of capturing Joe's intensity. And it was desperate days and weeks and months and years, because we were under complete siege. I was still working at the agency. I could not speak publicly. Joe had to carry all the water for both of us. And every time he stood up to defend himself or defend me, he was called a showboater. You know, oh, well, you know, they just wanted to, as it says in the movie, you know, Rove said, I guess, roll earth movers over Joe Wilson and his family. So I resigned from the agency in 2006 because it was clear to me that chapter was over. I mean, I didn't think my promotion prospects were particularly bright. I could no longer do the job for which I was highly trained, for which I loved. I could not serve in a covert capacity overseas. And there was just so much had happened. It just came to an end. So in that year, 2006, Joe and I decided to file a civil suit. And I can tell you, when he broached this idea with me, I didn't like it at all, because I just saw it as more it would ruin us financially. It would just drag this whole thing on so much longer. It was just, the whole thing was so painful to contemplate. And we had some discussions at some pretty high volume over that. But then as time went on and I realized really what was at stake and how badly they had acted and what it meant, the repercussions on myself and my family, we came to the conclusion that we needed to file the civil suit, that it was important because it has, as you know much better than I, different barriers or different information that is allowed into evidence and so forth, and depositions that a criminal case could not do. So we filed the civil suit for 3 reasons. The first one was to get to all the facts of what happened. Because even though Libby was from a grand jury, he was being prosecuted by Patrick Fitzgerald, named as special prosecutor. When that trial ended, Libby had said, Patrick Fitzgerald had said, it was like throwing sand in the umpire's eyes. You just couldn't get to what really happened. And the other thing he said that I thought was really important was that there is a cloud over the office of the vice president. He just couldn't get to where he needed to be to get all the prosecutions that he probably wanted. So it was to get out all the facts and depositions. Try to understand. I still don't know to this day how my name got to Novak. The second reason is to hold public officials to account. My husband and I happen to believe that if you hold public office, you should not be allowed to use that for your own political agenda. And finally, we wanted to make sure that that never happens again, that you have a covert CIA officer who is betrayed by their own government. I hope this is a one-off. But as Erwin may have spoken to some of you in class, I don't know how much he's talked about this, it went to the Supreme Court, who declined to hear it. So I'm not a lawyer at all, but what I do understand is what is left standing is a precedent that, in fact, public officials can use their positions for, you're paying their salary with your tax dollars to pursue their own partisan political agendas. As my husband says, he really would love to be the IRS commissioner one day, and go for it. So it's very unfortunate. I want Erwin to talk a little bit about some of the legal implications, but that is what is left standing. So in 2007, we looked around. We were still in Washington, D.C. We said, now why are we still here? We didn't have jobs. We didn't have family there. It's really hot and humid in the summer. So we moved our family to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where we are now. And we rebuilt our lives, personally and professionally. Last year, 2010, Fair Game came out with Naomi Watts and Sean Penn. And we were very much involved in the movie, and we thought that they did a pretty good job. It's a pretty accurate portrayal of what happened. Obviously, because it's Hollywood and it's a movie, events are condensed and there's some composite characters in there and so forth, but it essentially tells the truth of what happened. And we would love it if people, after seeing that movie, would think afterwards, if they can do it, so can I. About being engaged in your civic world, being an informed citizen and holding your government to account for their words and deeds. So whenever I have an opportunity to speak to students, and my husband does the same, we always try to say that despite our own experience, we truly believe we live in the greatest democracy in the history of the world. There's no doubt. We had faith in the legal system, in the justice system, and I always encourage those that as you leave the Irvine School of Law, that you might consider public service of some sort. It is something worthwhile. You are serving something bigger than yourself. It doesn't have to be in the CIA or the State Department. There's so many ways to contribute and being engaged in our democracy. Because if we're not, then basically I feel you have no right to complain. If your voice is not heard, don't be surprised if decisions are made that you don't agree with. And that's engagement is whether it's running for your library board or stuffing envelopes for a candidate you believe in, calling your mayor about the potholes down the street. Be engaged, be informed, take charge of what you can. So I'll just end with my favorite Churchill quote, because it sums up how we feel about it, and particularly in this election year where things get crazier and crazier and crazier, and you can be really discouraged, I think, by the whole political process. But Churchill said it best when he said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. So it's incumbent upon you in this classroom today to go out and to make sure that our democracy stays strong and we hold our elected officials to account at every step along the way. I thank you for your time. I really spoke longer than I meant to because I want to have time for Q&A, and I want Erwin to help facilitate that. So thank you very much.
Questions?
Let's take questions, yeah. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Thank you very, very much, both for your service to our country, and please accept my apology for us as citizens for what our political system did to you, and Ambassador Wilson. I see sort of eerie parallels between the war in Iraq with the rumor of nuclear weapons and the current political situation and the rumor of other nuclear weapons. I'm calling your particularly where they're hearing a lot of rumors of the need to do something. We hear there's one candidate, let's call it for a moment, the salamander, who's very, very worried that we need to bomb people who are the Iranis because they're developing these nuclear weapons immediately. And there's a great contrast. It sounds like voices of restraint by intelligence officials and defense officials, and yet a strong political pressure. Can you expand that parallel? And
Sure.
Is it the same or?
It does feel like deja vu all over again, doesn't it? Those of you that are young in this classroom, again, you were maybe you're just beginning to read the paper in a more conscious way, if you will. But there was, in the run-up to the war with Iraq, the media, I believe, completely abdicated their responsibilities in terms of telling the American people what was at stake. They just were spoon-fed by the White House and the administration, because it would take too much shoe leather to actually go around and talk to people that had real knowledge of what it would mean, how we get in, and more importantly, how we get out. And there was this great rah-rah jingoistic environment. And Joe was very much engaged in the debate in the run-up to the war with Iraq. And he wasn't just saying, war is bad. As I think it was Obama who said, I'm not against war, I'm against stupid wars. But he and the few other voices that expressed those opinions were shouted down. Oh, come on, it's going to be a cakewalk. The Iraqis will greet us as liberators. And in fact, the oil will be paying for the whole war in no time. In and out. And, then we've got a democracy, solid democracy right there in the Middle East. What a relief. What we're seeing in Iran today, I find appalling as I feel as though we are moving inexorably toward this, and we will find ourselves in the third war within a decade. For democracy, like the United States, it would be catastrophic. I do a lot of work now in a more overt fashion, obviously, but still on nuclear proliferation. And there's no doubt that Iran is, in fact, seeking to become part of the big boy nuclear club. No question. Question is, what do you do about it? Well, let me start with this, that no one in the government has spoken to Iran in over 30 years on an official. There's there's some back channel stuff, but what do you think that does to the possibilities that there might be misinterpretation, miscalculation, not really understanding? When you do not have a diplomatic exchange, full channels of communication, we don't give people diplomatic recognition as a cherry on the top. It's not it's not a reward for good behavior. No, we do it because it's in our self-interest. And I find it, particularly when you see the Republican candidates running for president, the rather glib way that they're willing to put, again, our sons and daughters, sisters and brothers into a military conflict that they have no idea. I believe, I'm not a military expert, but I do believe that there are generals in the Pentagon who are firmly against it because they know what is at stake, not just in terms of the horrors and treasure and blood of war, but because how difficult it would be and the unintended consequences that would flow from it. But I am hopeful that everyone who's in a position to do so is all hands on deck to try to reverse this, because it does feel like we're starting that slide into, well, Israel's going to attack sometime in March and April, and it takes on a certain aura of inevitability. And we can't even imagine where that will go. So that doesn't answer anything, but it just says I'm scared too. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I find curious about your case is that the Obama administration opposed your ability to go forward with your case. The position that they took was virtually identical to the position that the Bush administration took. In contrast to that, they launched a prosecution against a man in the NSA by the name of Thomas Drake with a lot of extraordinary charges, which they basically had to go down to a charge that I say was the equivalent of going to the bathroom without a hall pass. And I was just wondering what you think it says about the fact that they didn't want to allow your case to go forward, and they went after somebody like Drake, who was merely, in fact, a whistleblower about a program that had problems, that did not involve national security in the way he was talking about it.
I'll just comment, and then I want to turn it over to Erwin for further illumination. What can I say? I was deeply disappointed in that. You're right. The Obama administration sort of, if I understand it, sort of gave an unsolicited opinion that, yeah, we agree with them. What? It just, did you not read? Did you? I don't know. Can you talk about it in more thoughtful terms than that?
You said it perfectly. Henry, you're right. And it was a surprise. Maybe I'll just explain a little bit what the suit was about and why it was so surprising they did. The claims that were brought were First Amendment claims and Fifth Amendment claims. The First Amendment claim was that Joe Wilson's speech was punished because in retaliation for his expression, his wife's career was ruined. There was a Fifth Amendment claim for invasion of privacy by both Joe and Valerie because their privacy was invaded. Their lives, their children's lives were placed in danger. And then there was also a claim by Valerie with regard to a loss of property because her job was ruined as a result. Her career was destroyed. There's no statute that allows federal officers to be sued for money damages. Instead, the Supreme Court since 1971 has said that you can sue a federal officer for money damages directly under the Constitution. For those who had federal courts, they know this is called a so-called Bivens suit. So we brought a suit for money damages on behalf of Joe and Valerie against Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Louis Libby, Richard Armitage for violating these rights. The district court said it should be dismissed for two reasons. One is that there's a federal statute that exists that could provide a remedy called the Privacy Act. The district court judge said, well, since you have a statutory remedy, you don't need a constitutional remedy. Now, I question that premise, why the existence of a statute should mean you don't have a constitutional remedy, but the statute didn't apply. First, it doesn't apply to Joe at all because the statute only applies to those for whom the information was disclosed. It applied to information about Valerie. Also, the Privacy Act doesn't create any relief as against the office of the president or vice president. So it doesn't provide any relief whatsoever against Cheney or Libby or Rove. So what the district court said was a statute that doesn't apply precludes there being a constitutional cause of action. And second, the court said, well, allowing this lawsuit to go forward might reveal national security information. I liken this in the brief that we wrote to the child who kills parents and then begs for mercy for being an orphan, because after all, if there was any national security information released, it was done by the defendants. Besides that, we pointed out, after the trial of Louis Libby for perjury, everything about this was public. No reason to believe it released more national security information. And besides that, and all the lawsuits like this was at the motion to dismiss stage. We said if down the road it turns out there's national security information, the court can decide what to deal with it, but it's not a reason to dismiss the case. The D.C. Circuit, in a 2-1 decision, affirmed, and then it went to the Supreme Court. And I thought we had a really good argument for Supreme Court review, because the underlying question is, can a statute which doesn't apply preclude a constitutional cause of action? And the Obama administration filed a brief identical word for word to what the Bush administration would have filed. My only explanation for that is institutional interest. They were then the executive, and they were then defending the executive's interest, and that means stop there from being lawsuits against high-level executive officials. And there was no need for them to, they weren't to defend it either. As Valerie pointed out, Cheney, Rove, Libby, and Armitage all had their own separate lawyers. In fact, in the argument in front of John Bates, each of those lawyers got to argue as much as he wanted. They were all he's. And then I got up and I got about 20 minutes to respond to all of them. So, this didn't involve the United States. The Obama administration didn't have to file a brief at all in the Supreme Court, and yet did, urging the Supreme Court to deny review, which it did.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
What's your thought on WikiLeaks?
Julian Assange is really a hard character to like. That said, I believe that the preponderance of responsibility for protecting classified information rests upon the government. How is WikiLeaks any different? You know, I found it curious and amusing in a way that a lot of the typical media outlets, the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, they all sort of got up their righteous back on this. And it's like, really? It's because you're just ticked off you didn't get the scoop, huh? I mean, that's what it is. Who's going to make those decisions? It's okay if it appears in this outlet and not okay there. We know Dana Priest has done this great book called Top Secret America, and based on a series of articles she did in the Post now like 2 years ago. But the growth in top secret security clearances since 9/11, close to 1 million people now have top secret clearances. So how hard is it to keep track of all that? That's how we have the private. Who's the one who's what's his name with the wiki? Bradley Manning. Some 22-year-old kid. Sorry. Who has, access to diplomatic cables, what's going on with Berlusconi when he wasn't being prime minister, all this like unbelievable stuff that he should have. The government is so, and the explosive growth in what I would now call military-industrial intelligence complex since 9/11 has made WikiLeaks possible. Now, again, he'll go, they'll prosecute him accordingly and so forth, and who knows what happens with the girls in Sweden. But as I said, he's really not a heroic character. But I think it is a red herring to say, well, the government needs to look at how they are protecting truly classified information, and I don't think, I was sitting on a panel last year with a former former attorney generals talking just on that issue. And it was very interesting to see almost everyone with some variations was at that same point, that the onus rests on the government to protect classified information, and otherwise you're just running like a squirrel in a cage trying to make a case that it's okay for this media outlet to provide classified, to have a scoop on classified information, but not okay for that. It's the First Amendment, and that's inviolate. Yes? Yes?
How did you balance your professional life and call to serve with first relationships and then being a mother?
Well, I'm not allowed this is going to be public. Well, okay, so I have to be careful with my choice of words, and the reason is, in public, the agency will not permit me to acknowledge any agency affiliation prior to 2002. So I just appeared. But I think what I can say to that is that I had babies late in life. So I had, by the time babies came along, it was, how do I had done already a lot. I'm sorry I have to be so strange about that, but I'm trying to stick to the rules. So the real answer to that is like any working mom, really. I just had a little more unusual job, and there were when my children were toddlers, and just like every working mom, something's happening on Saturday or Sunday, and I had to bring them into the office. And you throw them graham crackers and some coloring books and hope for the best, that you get an hour to a piece so you can do what you need to do. They were young enough that I didn't see that as a that they had no idea where they were or what they were doing. And in terms of relationships, I was really fortunate when all this became very public, and really only a handful of people in my family knew where I worked, like my parents and my brother. I had really good friends that didn't say, oh, I can't believe you lied to us all these years. I mean, they understood I was not lying capriciously. It was not a whimsy. It was not, there was a reason. I'm protecting them. I'm protecting the people that I need to protect. And instead, when it all came out, my friends were like, oh, is that why you drive the way you do? And I had one very good friend. She said, oh, thank God, I thought you were like some mall's mistress or something, because you're always going, some mob's mistress, like a mall. And because I was, going around, and it explained a lot of things why I didn't really always have a steady job and so forth. And so it was, in fact, reassuring to them that there was a reason that I was living the life I was. But they are my close circle of friends. I guess I got really lucky. They were incredibly supportive and understood that the reason I could not tell them what I was doing it made sense to them. So, but in many cases, as I say, working moms are always my heroes because they're always juggling everything. I just happen to have a little unusual job.
Do you have one more?
One more?
So, Dean Chemerinsky commented on the legal stance of the Obama administration regarding your case, but I was hoping you'd be willing to comment on the kind of political momentum of the Obama administration in general regarding what you called the military-industrial intelligence complex and the lack of transparency from the executive that we kind of hoped would change when the Bush administration ended.
I look back to what happened with the Iraq War. I'll start there. And people always look at, how did we get there? How did we get here from there? How did that happen? And I think it was a perfect storm. And in that, you had a president who was uncertain about his foreign policy credentials. You had a vice president that had served in the Nixon White House and was very keen on the whole executive privilege that he thought had been seriously eroded since then, and the whole unitary theory of government and so forth. This very strong executive. You had neocons in very powerful positions that were, if you will, trying out an academic theory of how to spread democracy throughout the world. So that all came together at a time, and that's how we went to war. In terms of the executive power, I think we have seen enough over and over again that those out of power always want more transparency and more accountability and are always ready to beat their breast over it because it's what in a democracy should happen. But then when they get in power, they go, really, as Arwen was saying, it was a preservation in the case of why they wrote this unsolicited opinion. A preservation of power, institutionalized, and I won't even go off on what Citizens United and those decisions have wrought in terms of changes of how it's a perpetuation of power. And early on, obviously, the Obama administration had made a fundamental decision that they were not going to prosecute war crimes or anything of the sort. It's analogous a little bit to what happened after Iran-Contra, and Clinton and his administration made that very clear decision that we're just going to move forward and sweep all that under the rug. And what happens, you have felons like Elliott Abrams, who then go on to serve in later administrations, even though they had been deeply involved in some really criminal activity concerning Iran-Contra. So the Obama administration had made a clear decision in the Justice Department and the White House that they were not, and I don't think the American public's appetite for going back over that, what war crimes and what was particularly keen, because of course, as you may recall, as soon as Obama took office, the bottom had already fallen out of the economy, and everyone's just going, I've lost my job, who cares about war crimes? It's unfortunate. It was a moment in history, there was a window of opportunity where we could have, I believe that we are a strong enough country and a great enough country that we could have withstood that. You know, sunshine is a disinfectant, but events did not go in that way, and I don't know, if there was an Obama administration official up here, they would have very good arguments. You might be nodding your head with them too, why they should not go in a different direction. But that's what they chose to do. So it'll be interesting to see if this administration wins another 4 years, if they make some changes in how they approach things. Who knows?
Please join me in thanking
Thank you.
Valerie.